Hi everybody! So in this lecture we'll be exploring the psychosocial theories of personality, and I'm using this term loosely as the theorists that we'll discuss did not specifically refer to themselves as psychosocial theorists. Instead, what they all have in common is an emphasis on the social nature of ego development. And we're going to particularly focus on Alfred Adler, Harry Stack Sullivan, Erik Erikson, and Joan Loevinger. And then at the end of the lecture, we'll also briefly discuss this week's assessment measure, the Enneagram. And next week, we'll continue with our socially inclined theories, look at those that specifically pertain to object relations and attachment. Starting with Alfred Adler. So while Adler was president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society for some period of time, he claimed to never be a follower of Freud. In particular, he was strongly opposed to Freud's emphasis on sexual impulses in the development of personality. Instead, he focused on how social relationships and individual factors such as birth order, a sense of superiority or inferiority, etc., affect personality. He proposed that humans strive to master life rather than simply survive it, and he believed that we were primarily motivated by social interests rather than sexual ones. Adler had a profound impact on the field of psychology and influenced many of the theorists we've previously discussed, like Karen Horney, as well as ones that we'll discuss in this lecture, like Harry Stack Sullivan and Erik Erikson. Some have even gone so far as to argue that these individuals should be classified as neo-Adlerian rather than neo-Freudian, which speaks to his historical significance. More modern-day cognitive behavioral therapists, such as Albert Ellis, have proposed that he also laid the foundation for those theories, which are arguably the most popular today in the world of clinical psychology. Adler's offshoot of psychoanalytic theory is referred to as individual psychology, though some use the term Adlerian psychology too. He developed his theory in response to conceptual disagreements with Freud, and the growing sense that practitioners and theorists were losing sight of the importance of unity within the individual. One of the hallmarks of individual psychology is the relationship between inferiority and superiority. According to Adler, inferiority begins at birth. That is, that infants immediately feel inferior to their parents and to the world at large. This prompts the child to seek superiority through goal achievement. He argued that motivation is essentially a process of striving to overcome our inherent limitations. Therefore, everything we do is a reflection of a goal, and since it begins at birth, Adler argued that school teachers are equally influential compared to parents once the child is school-aged. He referred to organ inferiority as, just like it sounds, some kind of medical condition caused by issues with human organs, which makes sense considering he was trained as a physician. From here, the psyche attempts to compensate, and in doing so, may overcompensate. He suggested that hysteria and other physical symptoms reflect organ inferiority and the nervous system's attempt at compensation. From a broader perspective, Adler proposed that compensation reflects any attempts of overcoming challenges prompted by a sense of inferiority. These compensations do not need to be related either, so a college student who's unhappy with their grades might compensate by being an excellent surfer just as easily as by improving their study skills. Compensation can lead to balance, but overcompensation, that is, compensation taken to an unhealthy degree, will have problematic consequences. If the person is struggling to overcome these challenges via compensation, they will develop an inferiority complex. Adler was clear that we all have weaknesses and certain inferiorities, so to speak, but the important thing was whether our strengths could help to overcome them. If they do, great, but if they can't compensate for their weaknesses, the person will likely be filled with doubt and hesitation. This is where Adler can also be seen as a humanistic theorist, something we'll discuss in Unit 3. So where do superiority complexes come into play? Adler proposed that individuals who cannot overcome inferiority and/or who struggle greatly with their inferiority complex will develop a superiority complex. The superiority complex, therefore, is an extension of the inferiority complex. This is similar to the modern-day concept of narcissism. People with superiority complexes are not confident and self-assured. Instead, they're intensely insecure and mask it with arrogance and a domineering interpersonal approach. They are prone towards neuroses and other poor outcomes. Another contribution of Adler was the concept he referred to as style of life, which can be thought of as lifestyle. It essentially reflects pursuit of goals, which he believed is influenced by the past and influences the future. That is, if we know someone's personality in terms of their style of life, we can predict their future behaviors to some extent. His theories, therefore, are teleological in nature, that is, a perspective that looks forward towards the future rather than towards the past. He believed that parental approaches affect styles of life, and particularly focused on pampering or overindulgence compared to neglect or underindulgence. These factors, among others, lead children to develop a prototype of their lifestyle by approximately age 5. Adler's opinion was that pampering was worse than neglect, and that children who are pampered do not learn to take care of themselves or to develop healthy relationships. They are also at risk of feeling neglected later in life when relationships are more typical. In contrast, they'll seem void of the typical amount of indulgence they're used to. Adler argued that superiority should be achieved through social interest and cooperation. Humans are, after all, still animals, and we need richly connected social relationships to sustain us. We can accomplish more together than apart, and we're safer that way. He believed that we're born ready to cooperate and that it's a natural instinct. Moreover, if we don't have solid relationships, he'd warned that we'd always feel inferior. We benefit from helping others and from contributing to society. Happiness, from Adler's perspective, reflects social connectedness and the ability to transcend the self. Adler proposed 3 life tasks, which are work, which pertains to satisfying basic needs like food and housing, communal love, which reflects our shared humanity, and love, which is a satisfying relationship with the opposite sex. And I imagine if he were alive today, this would extend to same-sex romantic relationships too, or maybe I give Adler too much credit. If any of these 3 tasks are not satisfied, the person is characterized as having a mistaken style of life. Style of life is influenced by our creative powers, which contribute to how we interact with our inborn traits. He created the term fictional finalism to reflect the fact that children can be guided by fictional goals and fictional ideas about the world. Fictional finalism is considered healthy and does not equate with fictive superiority, which is the illusion of superiority associated with being pampered as a child. Adler was very interested in family dynamics, and in particular, birth order of children. He argued that only children are most at risk of being pampered and lose the opportunity to develop important social skills via sibling dynamics. They eventually go to school and must figure out how to interact with others, which he believed would most commonly lead to either passivity or combativeness. What's worse than an only child, though? The oldest child. And as the oldest of 4, this always stings a little. Why is the oldest the worst off? Because according to Adler, they were pampered as an only child for some small period of time, only to be dethroned by their next sibling. These children can become quite jealous and bitter, but it's not all bad news. They also tend to have special privileges, and are the biggest and smartest relative to their siblings because they're older. They're also prone to becoming overachievers as a strategy for maintaining the love, attention, and approval of their parents. The middle child is typically competitive because they must stay ahead of their younger siblings while trying to keep up with their older siblings. Note that Adler was the second of 6 children, so a middle child came up with all of this. According to Adler, the youngest sibling is the most spoiled, dependent, immature, and irresponsible. Interestingly, Adler viewed childhood misbehavior as one of 4 mistaken goals: attention, power, revenge, and giving up. The last Adlerian concept we'll touch on in this lecture are his 4 psychological personality types. They include the ruling type, who is generally domineering, energetic, and aggressive, either towards others or towards themselves. And he associated this with the choleric type that we talked about in terms of the 4 humors earlier in the course. The leaning type is associated with being phlegmatic and is described as sensitive, anxious, self-protective, and reliant on others. The avoidant type has very low energy and does not participate much with life. Adler warned that if these types were too reclusive, they were prone towards psychosis. They're also associated with the melancholic type. Lastly, the socially useful type is characterized as being balanced energetically. They are socially inclined, but not overbearing. They can acknowledge their faults, but are not consumed with inferiority. As you might guess, They are considered the healthiest of the 4 types and are associated with the sanguine type. You'll learn more about Alfred Adler in this week's video, The Psychology of Alfred Adler. If you're interested in learning more about his approach from a social work and educational perspective, which explores his theory in light of social justice and equity, I recommend the optional article provided in your module by McCluskey 2021 called Revitalizing Alfred Adler, an Echo for Equality. Like Karen Horney, Harry Stack Sullivan is typically classified as a neo-Freudian, which refers to the fact that he was heavily influenced by and expanded upon the classical Freudian psychoanalytic theories. But as I mentioned on the last slide, some argue that he should be classified as neo-Adlerian in light of Adler's massive influence on the developing field. We won't go into too much detail regarding Sullivan since there are 3 particularly influential theorists that I want to focus on in this lecture, which are Adler, Erikson, and Loevinger. But it felt incomplete to not at least touch on Sullivan too. Sullivan is most known for having extended Adler's work towards his own theory he called interpersonal psychology. It is based on his proposal that the purpose of development is to form and sustain improved interpersonal relationships. The foundation of anxiety and psychosis, from Sullivan's perspective, was due to parents who do not understand and cannot relate to their children, which leads to their children feeling unaccepted and unloved. Sullivan is also known for being a relatively early theorist who acknowledged the influence of culture on mental health and mental health conditions. Another contribution to psychology was Sullivan's theory that personality reflects the relationships we have with other people. This energy system reflects tension between needs for satisfaction and needs for security, along with energy transformation, that is, the behaviors needed to address those needs. Needs for satisfaction include all of our basic physiological needs, like food and water, as well as emotional needs like intimacy, and joyful needs like play and self-expression. Needs for security include those related to fear, which can be contrasted against security, which is viewed as the absence of or freedom from anxiety. Euphoria, on the other hand, reflects the absence of not only anxiety, but of all tension as well. Sullivan proposed that ego strength is correlated with our experience of anxiety. Those with greater ego strength are more able to confront their anxiety because they find it less threatening. The development of the self is based on the developing child's observation of their mother, which nowadays would likely be stated as caregiver, or at least should be. The child learns to differentiate between the good me, which are those behaviors that mom approves of and provides the child with security, and the bad me, which reflects the behaviors that cause mom anxiety. And the not me, which are those things that trigger extreme anxiety in mom, and therefore the child cannot hold an awareness because it's too intensely anxiety-provoking for them. Ultimately then, personality, according to Sullivan, reflects the ways in which needs influence a developing self, which influences the mode of thinking, which influences the approach of getting needs met, which then, of course, affects the self, and so on. He also introduced his own stage model of development, which he called developmental epochs. But since it's quite similar to Erikson's and less popular/widely accepted than Erikson's, I won't cover it here. And on that note, let's move right along to Erikson. Erik Erikson established himself as a prominent figure in psychoanalysis despite never earning his bachelor's nor any graduate degrees. His view on personality development contradicts Freud's view that personality remains unchangeable throughout life once it's firmly established early in the lifespan. Erikson's view proposed that development continues well beyond the age of 5, and that development is not dependent on unconscious sexual ideas and impulses. He argued that play was the child's so-called road to the unconscious, which Freud had previously attributed to dreams, and to adults. Erikson's interest in personality and developmental dynamics were fostered by feelings of exclusion from social circles as a Jewish child. This particularly influenced his stage of identity versus role confusion and led him to coin the term identity crisis. It was his experiences as an ostracized child, along with the influence of Anna Freud, that led Erikson to study psychoanalysis and to develop his theories of psychosocial stages. Erikson, as you probably know, is arguably most famous for reformulating Freud's 5 psychosexual stages of development into 8 so-called psychosocial stages. Essentially, his psychosocial lifespan model views human behavior as a reflection of the interaction between the internal world, particularly the ego, with the social world. If all goes well, the ego matures throughout the lifespan towards a healthy adult personality. He used the term epigenetic not in the sense that we discussed in the biology section, but rather as a term that means predictable development. Erikson framed these stages around crises, that is, conflicting ideas or tasks related to the social world that must be resolved in order to develop the ego strengths or virtues associated with each stage. Failure to resolve the conflict leads instead to inadequacy and a relatively weaker ego, which is important because ego strengths are not only relevant at the time they're developed, but in the future as well, as they're used to overcome future crises. Inadequacies, on the other hand, are associated with unhealthy personalities, though he did note that people could resolve them later in their lives, not only at the time listed in the stage model. This reflects one of the primary criticisms of Erikson's theory, which is that the stages are not exceptionally clear in terms of what it takes to successfully resolve them and when that needs to occur. With that said, it does provide a nice general framework of development that's helpful for conceptualizing some of the tasks of development and the relative consequences of whether those tasks are accomplished or not. Like Sullivan, Erikson also appreciated the role of culture on development and acknowledged that his model would not fit every cultural group. This is likely due to the fact that Erikson himself moved around quite a bit between Europe and the United States, which gave him personal insight into cultural differences. While he was aware of this fact, he did not set out to empirically investigate the extent to which it did or did not generalize. He has also been criticized for his male-dominant view of development, particularly the lack of recognition for the unique challenges females face in patriarchal societies. With that said, Erikson believed himself to be a supporter of women and never directly disparages women in any of his theories, so many have attributed some of the weaknesses of his theories from a feminist standpoint as a reflection of his time in history, that is, before the feminist movement brought more attention to these concerns. He was, after all, limited to an extent by the social constructs of his time. I also want to point out that his wife, Joan Erikson, contributed to the development of the stage model and even added a 9th stage after his death, which basically involves going through all of the stages again as the person faces their impending death. If successful, they move towards gerotranscendence, which is a deep awareness of one's life coupled with connection to the greater world while still maintaining ties to the past and a transcendent perspective regarding life. The first of Erikson's 8 stages is related to the psychosocial crisis surrounding trust, which is similar to Freud's concept of the oral stage in that they both focus on getting basic needs met. The question for the baby is, can I trust my caregivers to meet my needs? Will they feed me, cuddle me, come if I cry? Erikson focused on the mother, but again, this applies to whomever the primary caregiver or caregivers may be. If the baby determines that yes, my caregiver will respond properly if I cry and will take care of my needs, they will develop trust, which will allow for the strength or virtue of hope to emerge. If they cannot resolve this crisis, that is, they determine that their caregivers are unreliable or unpredictable, they will be mistrusting and rather than hope, will experience fear and anxiety. The second stage begins around toddler age up until about preschool age, which aligns with the anal stage of psychosexual development. This stage emphasizes exploration of one's body and attempts at mastering toilet training. Erikson proposed that primary caregivers are influential in this stage, particularly whomever is addressing toilet training with the child. The child resolves this stage by developing control and independence in their attempts towards toilet training, which is dependent on caregivers providing their child support while also encouraging their independence. If they're successful, they will feel confident in their autonomy and their abilities, and they will develop the strength of will or willpower. If not resolved, they will have low self-esteem and will feel ashamed of themselves if they determine that they are bad, and doubtful of themselves if they're unsure of their abilities. The next stage is initiative versus guilt, which occurs during the age of early childhood education, including preschool and potentially kindergarten, which overlaps with Freud's phallic stage. In this stage, all family members play a role as the child continues to try new things and begins to plan ahead with intentions and goals. Children at this stage are expected to focus on play and developing social skills. Successful resolution depends on family members supporting the child in their endeavors and resisting the temptation to exert too much control or to criticize too harshly. If they're able to acquire the skills they need to do so, they'll feel capable of initiative and of asserting themselves, which will lead to the development of purpose. If not, they're likely to experience peer rejection and disapproval, which can lead to guilt. The last stage of childhood prior to adolescence is industry versus inferiority, which aligns with the latency period of psychosexual development. Now the circle of influence widens even more to include school and neighbors. This stage is focused on accomplishing higher order goals than previously in development, such as completing science fair projects and playing sports. If they do well in school and with socializing and receive positive feedback, the child learns to take pride in their abilities and feels competent. If not, they feel inferior to their peers and their self-esteem suffers. The next stage of development, which is the last to overlap with the psychosexual stage, the genital stage of development, is identity versus role confusion. According to Erikson, this stage is focused on learning from peers and role models. It's considered a transitional stage between childhood and adulthood and is viewed as the most crucial stage in a person's life because the person must integrate all of their past experiences while figuring out what they want to become in the future. The main psychosocial crisis here is answering the question, who am I? If the person develops a sense of identity and can remain true to themselves, they develop the virtue of fidelity. Fidelity in this case reflects the ways in which we can abide by social standards while remaining true to our sense of who we are at our core. Failure to do so, however, leads to a weak or lack of personal identity that leaves the person vulnerable to conformity pressures and a sense of confusion about themselves. Next, we have the stage that most of you are currently in, which is intimacy versus isolation. The actual ages for the adult stages vary, but it's viewed as early adulthood. In this stage, friends still play a central role, but partners also begin to take center stage as far as influences go. The task of this stage is building long-lasting and deeply connected relationships, both with friends and with romantic partners. If the person accomplishes this task, they develop the virtue of love. If not, they're likely to feel lonely and isolated, which is particularly likely if they did not successfully resolve the earlier stages. The next stage reflects middle adulthood and the psychosocial question of whether we're making meaningful contributions to society. Now, instead of friends having a large influence, the emphasis moves to our home lives and work lives. Adults in this stage need to nurture people and the things that will outlast them, whether that's through raising children, volunteering for social causes, or acting in professional leadership roles. If the individual successfully resolves this crisis by finding meaningful avenues for contributing to society, they develop the virtue of care. If not, they may feel a sense of disconnection or feel unfulfilled, unproductive, and stuck. Hello, midlife crisis. The last stage occurs during late adulthood, which again, the exact number varies, but it usually starts around 65. In this stage, the person looks back on their lives to determine the successes and failures that have occurred. It's time for memories. Ego integrity involves acceptance of one's life, including what came before and what's left, in a way that feels coherent and whole. If we're successful, we experience a sense of wisdom and feel proud of our lives, which doesn't mean we don't also experience moments of doubt and despair. But if we cannot achieve integrity, we may feel immensely guilty, disappointed, bitter, and or fearful of our impending death. And again, according to Joan Erikson, people facing death move through the stages again towards the potential positive outcome called gerotranscendence. If you're interested in learning more about Erikson stages, I recommend the optional article this week, Case Study Using Erikson's Developmental Stages by Best 2013, which provides an example case study with in-depth, detailed analysis of the case study in terms of Erikson's first 5 stages of development. You might not only find it interesting, but also helpful in preparing for your case study quiz this week. Erikson's psychosocial stage model of development has also been applied to mental health recovery. This developmental model of recovery, provided by Vogel, Skibilia, and colleagues, 2009, is grounded in Erikson's theory, but uses slightly different terms to correspond with the process of recovering from mental health challenges. In their model, stage 1 involves movement towards acceptance of the mental health diagnosis and trust in the consistency and accessibility of recovery and care. Stage 2 involves grieving the loss of the previous mental health experiences and furthered recovery acceptance. The person needs to develop new coping skills and abandon the maladaptive ones. Ideally, they have increased contact with others to decrease feelings of shame and isolation. Stage 3 involves pursuing empowerment and decreasing the sense of disability by minimizing residual symptoms or recurrent episodes. The person at this stage must deal with society's expectations and address the corresponding frustration and anger. Stage 4 involves fighting against static disability and isolation by finding and/or creating a social niche. At this stage, it's important to seek purposeful work and leisure pursuits. Stage 5 involves trying to separate personal identity from the mental health condition by adopting person-first language, such as a person with schizophrenia instead of a schizophrenic. Note that this does not apply to autism, as the autistic community has been quite clear that they are proud of this diagnostic label and see it as a valuable and meaningful part of their identity. Stage 6 involves forming intimate relationships by seeking out intimacy with a peer to share recovery life and develop a sense of mutual understanding and respect. Stage 7 involves finding a life strategy for living well with their mental health condition and finding fulfillment with one's current life. This might involve giving back to others while they search and adopt a life niche. In my doctoral dissertation, using their experience to help others was a particularly important step towards finding stability with a physical chronic illness. Lastly, in stage 8, the person reflects on their life, lived with the psychiatric recovery, and acceptance of the life changes caused by the mental health condition. The last theorist we'll discuss in this lecture is Joan Loevinger, who is heavily influenced by Erikson. In fact, she was his assistant while she attended graduate school. Loevinger is particularly well known for two things. One, her theory of ego development, which we'll look at on the next slide, and two, the assessment measure she created to evaluate ego development, which is the Washington University Sentence Completion Test. Loevinger developed the theory of ego development as a conceptualized framework based on Erikson's work. Her view of the ego was that it's a process that emerges from the interaction between the self and the world. The purpose of the ego, from her perspective, was to make sense of the external world in order to make sense of it internally and determine how to best interact with it. It focuses on the development of the ego, the concept of self, and of self-esteem. She believed that understanding the self was at the center of human development, and her view was that the ego is best conceptualized as the orchestrator of personality and identity through its emphasis on meaning-making and interactions with the external world. It's not conceptually dependent on chronological age, but rather a sequence of stages that tend to increase with age. The stages are quantitatively different from each other and become increasingly more advanced with each successive stage. But older age is not a guarantee of ego development, and many adults remain fixed in one of the middle stages. Loevinger developed the Washington University Sentence Completion Test as a measure of ego maturity, though it's used more broadly as a test of psychological development too. Interestingly, it was initially developed for women, but was extended to all genders not long afterwards. Research has shown that it has good construct validity, internal reliability, and inter-rater reliability. It consists of 36 sentence stems that the person completes, such as a good father, ... or when I am criticized, ... Responses are coded using a system that Loevinger built and has since been empirically supported. The manual provides self-training to guide the scorer about using the manual, and a section that demonstrates the scoring process using a system of themes and examples of possible responses. Loevinger's model begins with stage 1, which is the moment of birth until the time at which the infant is able to separate the idea of itself from its surroundings and its caregivers. The first part of stage 1 is called the pre-social stage and reflects the basically egoless period in which the infant must first learn to differentiate itself from the external world at large. The second part of stage 1 is the symbiotic stage, which involves the process of differentiating itself from other selves, most importantly from the primary caregiver. Once that occurs, the child can move into stage 2, which is characterized by impulsivity underlined by sexual and aggressive impulses. The child uses its impulses to help separate out their own sense of identity and it's manifested behaviorally in a lot of saying no and demanding to do things by oneself. Anyone who's spent time around a toddler knows what this stage looks like. Children at this stage see the world in a black and white dichotomous fashion. Things are good or bad, nice or mean, and people are valued for what they can provide. They tend to feel emotions powerfully and physiologically, and they're very rooted in the present moment. In the next stage, the child begins to become increasingly aware of consequences, both reward and punishment. They respect rules to a degree, but the emphasis is on not getting caught in order to avoid punishment. Children at this stage are unlikely to take responsibility and tend to blame it on others, or even on an imaginary friend. Just like it sounds, the emphasis of this stage is on protecting the self while attempting to interact effectively with the environment. These people tend to be exploitative, manipulative, competitive, and opportunistic. If the person moves beyond the self-protective stage, they have moved from the category of pre-conventional development to conventional development. The category of conventional development includes the conformist, self-aware, and conscientious stages and reflects approximately 80% of the adult population. In the conformist stage, the person respects rules and boundaries, primarily in order to maintain social acceptance with their group. Unlike the earlier self-protective stage, the conformist follows the rules because they've established and been accepted by the group, and they fear disapproval, not punishment per se. They begin to establish their self-perception, which can be evaluated by having them fill in the blank of, I am a blank person, angry, kind, generous, impatient, etc. They are also likely to view themselves as an interconnected part of the group, so they tend to ignore individual differences and tend to value collaboration over competition. Interestingly, Loevinger believed college could be helpful for promoting growth, but also could create an immense pressure to conform. If the person moves beyond the conformist stage, they have moved into the self-aware stage, which is characterized by more openness to possibilities. Rather than being defined by ideals, the person is more in touch with the nuanced gray areas of life and with a wider array of feelings, including self-consciousness. At this stage, they engage in less stereotyping and begin to see exceptions in norms and rules. They're also beginning to be able to engage in healthy self-criticism and reflection. Loevinger proposed that many adults enter a plateau at this level and do not progress further, or that they take quite a bit of time before they do so. She suggested that very few are able to move beyond this stage until at least their mid to late 20s. If they do move on, it's to the conscientious stage, in which the person develops empathy and a sense of perspective that increasingly differentiates themselves from others. At this stage, the person develops standards and a stronger sense of personal responsibility and drive towards personal achievement. While earlier they followed rules to avoid punishment and then to maintain group norms, now they actually internalize and choose rules and make decisions based on their own beliefs. The person also has increasing awareness of moral relativism and can point out exceptions to rules and contexts in which rules should not apply. They are more likely to experience guilt in response to doing something they know is hurtful than something that technically breaks the rules. This stage is also characterized by increased recognition and understanding of other people's opinions. Stage 7 reflects the beginning of the third and final category of ego development, the post-conventional category, which begins with the individualistic stage. In this stage, the person is concerned with finding a balance between independence and connectedness. They respect individuality and have concern for emotional dependence. People in this stage are increasingly able to tolerate complexity, contradiction, and paradox, and overall have more tolerance for individual differences. Loevinger thought it was relatively rare that a person would move beyond stage 7, but must have thought it was possible enough to bother conceptualizing 2 final stages. In stage 8, the autonomous stage, the person develops deeper respect for other people's decisions and lifestyles. People at this stage desire self-fulfillment more so than outer achievement. These individuals recognize interdependence while respecting individual autonomy, and they seek to be fair, objective, and justice-oriented. The final stage of ego development, according to Loevinger, is referred to as the integrated stage, or sometimes as the construct-aware stage, which reflects the fully mature ego. This stage is conceptually similar to another theory we'll discuss in Unit 3, which is Maslow's idea of self-actualization. Individuals who reach this stage are immensely empathic, skilled at perspective taking, deeply understanding, self-accepting, and wise. You'll learn more about Loevinger's model and ego development in general in 2 articles this week, which are nice complements to each other and provide a lot of depth regarding this week's major ideas and how they can be used to promote growth in adulthood. First, advancing ego development in adulthood through the study of the Enneagram style of personality by Daniels et al., 2018, and second, in Cam and Fluitt's 2021 article, combining the Enneagram and narrative therapy for adult ego development. And, speaking of the Enneagram, let's take a look at the assessment you'll be taking this week. If you haven't already, I recommend pausing the video here and coming back once you've completed it. The Enneagram existed long before the development of psychosocial theories or even the theoretical concept of ego development. In fact, it's based on ancient spiritual traditions, thought to potentially have originated in Afghanistan. While it has a spiritual foundation, it is not considered to have any specific religious ties. Nonetheless, it is an assessment measure that is often used in conjunction with ego development, which you'll see in both of this week's assigned peer-reviewed articles. The Enneagram, like all other assessment measures, has pros and cons, and we'll briefly look at its reliability and validity on the next slide. But first, let's do a brief overview. The Enneagram is based on the stress and resilient qualities of an individual, which is in stark contrast to the Myers-Briggs emphasis on the unconscious cognitive functions that drive behavior. It also differs from the Myers-Briggs in that it provides information about an individual's strengths, but also their weaknesses. Also, unlike the coding approach to the Myers-Briggs, the Enneagram has 9 specific types, which are categorized into 3 so-called triads, which each have 3 types. One triad is called the instinctive triad, which includes types 8, 9, and 1. These individuals share a tendency towards action, doing, and moving, and their core emotion is anger. Next, the feeling triad includes types 2, 3, and 4, which all share a focus on self-image and a core emotion of shame. Lastly, the thinking triad includes types 5, 6, and 7, whose focus is on thought processes and their core emotion is fear. Each type can have what is referred to as a wing. In fact, each type can have no wings, 1 wing, or 2 wings. Wings can only be adjacent to the primary type. So for example, a type 2 can have 1 and or 3 as their wings. This is written as primary type number followed by W for wing, followed by the wing number. So 2W1 would be interpreted as a type 2 with a 1 wing, whereas 2W3, a type 2 with a 3 wing. And 2W1/3 is an example of balanced wings. This person is a type 2 with evenly balanced 1 and 3 wings. Wings are not bound by triad separation. As you can see, a 2 with a 1 wing has a primary type in the feeling triad with a wing in the instinctive triad. The primary personality type is considered dominant, but the wing or wings complement and provide depth to our personalities. One aspect of the Enneagram that I find particularly interesting is the distinction between what each type tends towards in times of growth or security compared to in times of stress. In the image, you can see black and red arrows coming from and pointing towards each of the types. The black arrows represent the direction of integration, which reflects the tendency of each type in times of health and growth. For example, a type 6 in a good place in their lives gravitate towards the positive aspects of a type 9, including their relaxed nature and optimism. In contrast, the red arrows reflect the direction of disintegration, that is, our tendencies when we are stressed. The type 6 in times of stress gravitates towards the negative aspects of a type 3, such as their arrogance and competitiveness. Before we discuss the individual types, I want to touch on the reliability and validity of the Enneagram. First, I want to acknowledge that it's quite difficult to summarize because there are so many unique assessments built on the foundation of the Enneagram, and they all refer to themselves as the Enneagram. Nonetheless, let's look at some of the findings. First, as you'll see in this week's peer-reviewed articles, the Enneagram has been found to be useful for promoting self-insight and understanding of others. In my opinion, that's a good enough reason to explore it. Of course, like all assessments though, it runs the risk of being skewed by self-report data, as well as increasing the tendency to label, stereotype, and overly simplify human nature. To my knowledge, there's also limited cross-cultural research to demonstrate how and/or if it applies to non-Western cultures despite its lineage from the Middle East. One interesting finding that appears to support some biological or genetic support for the Enneagram is the finding that monozygotic twins reared apart are 3 times more likely to have similar Enneagram types compared to dizygotic twins. Overall, from the research I've seen, the Enneagram has decent concurrent validity with both the Myers-Briggs and the Milan scales, which you'll learn about in the last unit of the course. It also has decent test-retest reliability and internal reliability, but I've seen less demonstration of construct validity, though anecdotally, it does seem to have good face validity. As I've mentioned, there are many approaches to the Enneagram, so findings are dependent on the particular approach. You're assigned to take the Truity version because it's free and because I got the same type as I have on other paid versions, including the Essential Enneagram. If you're interested in finding out more or cross-validating for yourself, I personally really liked the Essential Enneagram approach, which provides paragraphs for each type that you read to determine what fits and what doesn't. It's quite different than the typical forced choice approach, and I find it really interesting. You can buy the book online for about $8, and it also provides a lot more depth about each type. You can also purchase the other gold standard version, called the Riso-Hudson Enneagram Type Indicator, or the READY for short, online for about $12. I do not recommend paying for Truity's $19 full report, but you're welcome to do so, obviously, if you're interested. Okay, let's finish off this lecture with a brief discussion of the 9 types. And again, if you haven't taken it already, I strongly recommend that you pause here, take the assessment before learning about the types. We're going to look at each of the types in order, but keep in mind that type 1 belongs to the instinctive triad, whereas types 2, 3, and 4 on this slide are part of the feeling triad. Also note that each specific assessment has their own names for each type, so I've included the 2 or 3 more common terms for each type that I've seen, but be prepared to see other terms depending on the source. Type 1 is the reformer, also known as the perfectionist and the idealist, who desires to be right and good. They are prone towards fixating on inadequacies and hold themselves and others to very high standards. This is due to the fact that this type believes they must be good and right in order to be loved and accepted. Next, we have type 2, the helper or the giver, who desires love and affection and wants to be needed because they believe you have to earn people's love by being giving. They are described as being empathetic, altruistic, and generous, but can also be manipulative, intrusive, demanding, and possessive. Type 3s are known as the achiever or the performer, and desire to be valued for their actions because they believe you have to be successful to be loved. This type is the center of the feeling triad, and thus most prone to shame. They are productive, efficient, ambitious, and motivated towards self-improvement and excellence, but can also be narcissistic, hostile, and exploitative. Next is type 4, the individualist or the romantic, who desires authenticity and uniqueness. They are idealists who are self-aware, creative, intuitive, and sensitive, but can also be dramatic, self-absorbed, self-conscious, and moody. Type 5 is known as the investigator or the observer. These individuals have a lot of mental focus and are driven towards being experts in their field because they believe security comes from taking care of yourself. They desire to be competent and proficient, and they have strengths such as being analytical, curious, self-sufficient, and perceptive. On the other hand, they can be emotionally detached, withholding, and eccentric. Type 6, the loyalist or the loyal skeptic, desires certainty, stability, and security in order to protect themselves from the challenges of the world. As the center of the thinking triad, this type is most prone to fear. They are described as responsible, trustworthy, and anxious, and they strongly value emotional connectedness and make great friends. They're also at risk of being overly dependent on others, suspicious of others, and consumed with a sense of self-inferiority. Next, we have type 7, the enthusiast, also known as the dilettante and as the epicure, who desires happiness and satisfaction above all else. They are spontaneous, enthusiastic, pleasure-seeking, and adventurous, value enjoyment and productivity, but can also come across as hyperactive, uncommitted, and avoidant of pain and other unpleasantries. Type 8, referred to as the challenger, the controller, or the protector, believe that power is the route to protection. They tend to be more confrontational and emphasize values like justice. They are assertive, self-confident, and can make great leaders. However, they can also be domineering, insensitive, and impulsive. Lastly, type 9 is the peacemaker or mediator, who seeks peace and harmony because they believe that to be loved, you must be easygoing and get along with everyone. This type is the center of the instinctive triad, so they are most prone toward anger, though they are not as likely to show it. They value ethics, social harmony, personal responsibility, discipline, and delayed gratification, but are prone towards being overly judgmental, stubborn, and conflict avoidant. If you're interested in learning more about these types, I recommend the optional video this week, Introduction to the Enneagram. You might also really enjoy the Dr. Daniel Siegel episode of Chelsea Handler's podcast, Life Will Be the Death of Me, called My Psychiatrist Explains My Personality and Yours. He does an excellent job describing the nuanced aspects of each type, and I really enjoyed it.